Snow fell in slow, tired spirals, soft as ash drifting from some far-off fire. The streets of the little frontier town groaned under the weight of winter, boards of the boardwalk creaking under the boots of the few souls still out in the cold. A single lantern swayed above the mercantile's porch, its light spilling in a dim halo that caught the shape of a woman walking alone. Her shawl was thin, the wool worn to a pilling fuzz, and inside it she carried the small, bony weight of her daughter pressed against her chest. The child's breath came in shallow puffs, warm for a moment against her skin before the wind carried away. The mother kept her head low, hair damp with melting snow, as if lowering her eyes could somehow hide the hollow in her cheeks. Hunger had a way of making the bones in a face sharper, more visible than a person would ever want. Hunger was a thief that took slowly, piece by piece, and never gave anything back. Hunger, she thought, was a fire that burned without giving warmth. It smoldered deep in her belly, but it did not comfort. It consumed. It was a crueler companion than loneliness. And she had known both long enough to understand how they twisted together, making the nights colder still. The girl stirred against her, coughing, the dry, brittle kind that worried her more than the deep ones. It was the cough of weakness, of a body losing ground. The cupboard back in the small, one-room shack they'd been calling home was as bare as her purse. She had counted the coins that morning and had come up short, even for flour. That was why her boots found their way here tonight, crunching through snow toward the man whose name she had not spoken in years. He had been a storekeeper once, then a cattle buyer, always with the same quick little smile that didn't touch his eyes. She had avoided him when she could, but desperation made her path narrow, until there was only this. The bell above his door jingled when she stepped in. Warmth hit her face, smelling faintly of tobacco and dust. He was at the counter, tallying something on a scrap of paper, and looked up without surprise. The way his eyes trailed down her frame made her want to clutch her shawl tighter. "I came to talk," she said, voice low so the girl wouldn't wake. He leaned his elbows on the counter, listening without nodding, without any kindness softening his stare. The words caught in her throat, the shape of them heavy, ugly. She thought of bread in her child's hands, thought of beans simmering on a stove, thought of anything but what she was about to say. "If I give you one night," she murmured, barely louder than the tick of the wall clock, "will you give my daughter food?" The silence afterward was long enough to count each heartbeat. His smile came, thin and mean, as if he were enjoying some joke she hadn't heard. He stepped around the counter, close enough that she could see the flakes of snow melting in his hair. He toyed with the offer like a cat with a dying mouse, asking what she thought one night was worth in this town, telling her how other women would be happy enough to take less. When she didn't answer, his tone grew sharper, the words barbed, meant to pierce. Her cheeks burned, and not from the heat of the stove. Shame slid cold down her spine. She turned before his words could sink any deeper, the bell over the door clanging hard behind her as she stepped back into the snow. The wind had picked up. Snow was finding its way into her boots, numbing her toes, but she didn't care enough to fix it. The girl was heavy in her arms now, head lolling against her shoulder, too tired to hold on tightly. She kept walking, not toward home. Home was just four walls with no bread, but toward nowhere at all. That was when the sound of hooves broke through the hiss of wind. She turned slightly, tightening her hold on the girl. A rider slowed beside her, a man's silhouette against the pale night, the snow dimpling his coat. "You'll freeze out here," his voice said, steady and quiet. She didn't answer, not knowing what kind of man he was. But he dismounted without waiting for an invitation, his boots crunching into the snow beside her. He smelled faintly of cedar smoke and leather as he stepped close enough to see the child in her arms. Without touching her, he motioned toward his horse. Her legs wanted to refuse, to keep walking, but the girl was shivering, and the sight of that horse's steaming breath felt like an open door. He lifted the child first, careful as if she were glass, then offered his hand to her. She let him pull her up, her shawl falling open as she settled in behind him. The horse moved forward at a slow, deliberate pace, and the snow no longer bit so hard at her face. She said nothing. Neither did he. Up ahead, A warm glow began to cut through the dark. The shape of a cabin took form, low roof, smoke curling from the chimney, a light in the window like a beacon. He said nothing when they reached it, only swung down, lifted her daughter into his arms again, and opened the door to the heat inside. That night, she expected a transaction. Instead, she found the first warm room in months that asked for nothing in return. Morning came slow, a pale light seeping in through the small paned window, softened by the frost gathered in the corners of the glass. She woke to warmth under her, the weight of quilts pressing gentle against her legs. For a long, bewildered moment she didn't move, unsure if she was still dreaming. It had been so long since she'd felt the give of a Real mattress instead of straw, or the scratch of blankets not worn to rags. The air in the room smelled faintly of coffee and something baking, cornbread, she thought, though she hardly remembered the scent except in passing from other people's kitchens. Her daughter was curled beside her, breathing deep, her face flushed with the heat of the room instead of the cold. There was no cough now, just the quiet rhythm of sleep. She eased herself from the bed, the floor warm under her bare feet, and followed the faint sounds of movement into the main room. He was there, already dressed for the day, a kettle resting on the stove and a pan on the table holding a round loaf with a crisp brown crust. His back was to her, but he glanced over one shoulder when she stepped in. She opened her mouth, the words heavy, before they even found air. "I can pay you," she began, voice soft but steady. "Not with coin, but I can pay." He didn't turn fully, just reached for the kettle and poured coffee into a tin cup, setting it on the table for her, without comment. "Sit," he said simply, as if she had only spoken about the weather. And then he began talking about the snow, about how the cattle had wintered better than he'd expected, about the trap he'd found sprung near the creek. Her offer hung between them, unacknowledged, and then disappeared into the steam rising from her coffee. The cabin felt built for one man's life, but cared for in a way that made it sturdy rather than lonely. The walls were lined with logs darkened from years of firelight. A shelf held a scattering of books, their spines cracked and softened, along with a Bible whose thin pages bent like leaves in a dry wind. On the mantel was a carving of a horse, smooth from handling, the work of someone with patient hands. He kept to himself most hours, working the small patch of land behind the cabin or tending to the cattle in the snowpack corral. She began to notice little things about him, how his steps never startled the hound dog that slept by the hearth, how he checked the roof after every heavy snow, how he didn't waste words when silence would do. Her daughter took to the dog quickly, sitting on the floor and tracing the lines of his grizzled muzzle, while the animal thumped his tail. Sometimes the dog would follow her outside, and the two of them would play in the snow while she watched from the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself, feeling the sharpness of the cold and something else she couldn't name. One afternoon she returned from bringing in wood to find her boots with seams split and leather cracked, set near the stove, mended with neat, sturdy stitches. She didn't need to ask who had done it. When they went into town for supplies, she felt the eyes of people on her, the slight pause in their voices as she passed. The whispers weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. He didn't so much as glance toward them. He walked beside her in the narrow aisle of the trading post as if there were nothing to see, speaking to her about flour prices, about whether the spring rains might come early. There were other faces in town who left different marks. Mrs. Fallon, with her eyes like polished buttons and a tongue quick enough to slice through pride, was the first to stop her on the boardwalk. "He's a good one," she said, chin tilting toward the man waiting at the hitching post. "Don't go breaking him." It was hard to tell if she meant it as a warning or a blessing. Tommy, the blacksmith, was another. Built like the forge he worked in, broad and warm and a little loud. He teased the man about finally letting someone else make the coffee in the morning. His grin softened when he looked at her daughter, though, offering her a tiny horseshoe charm with a wink. As the days stretched, she caught herself moving around the cabin as if she belonged there, baking bread without asking, mending a tear in the curtain, leaving her shawl hanging by the door. Yet at night, when the fire was low and the wind pressed against the walls, the thought would come back sharp. When would he name the price for all of this? And how deep would it cut when he did? The snow began to melt into a thin, dirty crust, And the rain came, soft at first, then steady. One evening, the sound of it on the roof filled the room, the smell of wet earth mixing with the fire's heat. She was mending her daughter's dress when he spoke from the table, voice quiet but certain. "You can stay until spring," he said, as if the decision had been made long ago. "But no one owes me nothing for kindness." She kept her eyes on the thread in her hands, not trusting herself to answer. She didn't believe him, not yet. But the words settled somewhere deep, where the cold hadn't reached in years. The snow melted in slow retreat, turning the dirt roads into narrow rivers that carried the winter away grain by grain. The air smelled of thawed earth and damp wood, the world softening under a sky that promised new things. He was in the corral that morning, the steady rhythm of his hammer carrying across the yard, mending a broken rail. She stood by the small garden patch near the cabin, fingers deep in the cold soil. It had been years since she'd planted anything for herself, yet here she was, coaxing seeds into the ground as though she might be here to see them grow. Her daughter laughed from the pasture, perched on the wide back of his old mare. The horse's ears flicked lazily as he led her in slow circles, one hand holding the reins, the other steadying the small frame in the saddle. When the girl urged the mare into a clumsy trot, he let her try, his calm voice carrying instructions without a hint of worry. Later, when the girl went to fetch water, he handed her a board to lay across the garden rows. "Keeps the cat from digging," he explained. She balanced it carefully in place, and without warning, a laugh escaped her, light, almost unsure, as if she had forgotten the sound of it. It startled her, that laugh. She caught him watching from the fence, not smiling in the broad way most men did, but with a quiet satisfaction, like hearing a song you'd thought was lost. Their days settled into a rhythm that felt almost shared. He began asking her opinion on things, how many cattle to keep near the creek, whether the wagon needed new wheels before summer. The questions came without ceremony, as though her voice had always belonged in those decisions. One afternoon she found a tear in the sleeve of his work shirt and set to mending it while he sat at the table going over accounts. When she finished and reached to hand it back, their fingers brushed. It was nothing, a simple accident, but she felt the steady weight of his hand, the warmth of it lingering long after she'd drawn hers away. There was no rush in him, no grasping, just the kind of closeness that built itself like layers of paint, one thin wash over another, until the color deepened without you noticing. But spring also carried voices on the wind. At the trading post, she caught the tail end of a sentence, her name followed by the low chuckle of men leaning against the counter. Later, Mrs. Fallon told her in a blunt tone that the storekeeper, the man she had gone to that first night, had been talking in town, saying she had a way of finding men to take her in, saying she was no better than the women who loitered near the saloon when the lamps were lit. The whispers crawled through the town like ants, invisible until they were everywhere. A week later, in the general store, a woman she once knew crossed her path. The woman's mouth curved in a smile too thin to be kind. She spat near the toe of her boot before walking on. The air between them went taut, the sound of the spittle hitting was sharp as a shot. Before she could move, he was there, standing beside her, saying nothing, doing nothing but letting his shadow fall over the space between her and the others. His stillness spoke more than words. He wasn't a man to rise to taunts, but neither would he let them land unanswered. Eventually, the tension thinned, and the other customers turned back to their errands. They left the store without speaking of it. She kept her eyes forward, the weight of his quiet presence walking beside her heavier than the sack of flour in her arms. At night, when the house was still, she turned those moments over in her mind. She wanted to believe this life was hers to keep, that she wasn't simply passing through a kindness that would end with the season. But the past had taught her that anything given could be taken, that one day, without warning, she might find herself standing in the snow again, shawl pulled tight, begging for bread. The thought kept a part of her heart locked away, even when the rest of her wanted to open the door. One evening, the wind came up hard from the west, bringing the smell of rain. She was bringing in the washing from the line when she saw it, a lone figure on horseback, high on the ridge where the last of the snow still clung. He sat his horse, still as stone, watching the cabin. She knew the shape even from this distance. The tilt of the shoulders, the way the brim of his hat cut the sky. The man from that first night. The bargain she had tried to make. She stood with the laundry in her arms, the cloth whipping against her hands, and watched until the figure turned his horse and disappeared over the rise. The sun was sinking low, setting the sky ablaze in wildfire orange, the light spilling over the ridge like molten metal. Out of that glow came a rider, hard and fast, the storm chasing him from behind. Hooves struck the earth in an urgent rhythm, the dust curling in his wake. She stood at the window, her hand resting against the frame, her daughter at her side. Something in her chest tightened. She knew that silhouette, knew the crooked set of his shoulders even before his face came into view. By the time he reined in at the yard, the storm had drawn closer, a low rumble rolling over the hills. He swung down from his horse with a stagger in his step, the sharp bite of whiskey drifting ahead of him. His eyes were small and mean in the fading light. Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped up onto the porch, boots thudding heavy, and looked her over like a man remembering a debt unpaid. "Well," he said, voice rough, "seems you've done all right for yourself. Didn't take you long, did it?" His gaze flicked toward her daughter, and the cruel twist of his mouth deepened. "Wonder if she knows the deal you once tried to make." The words landed like stones in her stomach, but she didn't move back. Not this time. Not anymore. Her knees felt weak, her throat dry, but she stepped out into the space between him and the door. Her hands were shaking. She let them. Her voice trembled at first, but then it steadied, each word clear as glass. "My worth isn't yours to measure," she said. "Not then. Not now. Not ever." The wind picked up, rattling the shutters, carrying the smell of rain. Behind her, the cattleman shifted, slow, deliberate, placing himself just off her shoulder, between her and the man on the porch. His hand rested near his holster, the weight of it more a promise than a threat. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He stood there like the ground itself, waiting, giving her the space to finish what she had started. For a long moment, no one moved. The storm seemed to hold its breath with them, the sky split by a flicker of distant lightning. The intruder's eyes darted between them, the measure of the moment finally reaching him. He spat into the dirt, muttered a curse, and turned away. His boots hit the steps hard as he descended, his shoulders hunched against the wind. By the time he mounted his horse, the rain had begun to fall in cold, needling drops. He rode off into the storm, swallowed by it. The quiet that followed was heavier than the confrontation itself. Inside, the lamplight pooled in warm gold around them. She leaned against the wall for a moment, letting her breath come back. The cattleman busied himself with the lamp, adjusting the wick, his back to her, until she spoke. "I don't think I want to leave in the spring," she said softly. He didn't answer right away. When he turned toward her, there was no speech, no grand declaration. Just the steady step across the room, the way his fingers found hers without hurry, holding them in the warmth between their palms. He didn't let go. By the fire, her daughter had drifted to sleep, her small frame curled under the quilt, her hair catching the lamplight in threads of gold. Outside, the storm moved on, its voice fading into the distance. The truth settled over the room like the quiet after rain. Dignity was never something handed down by others. It was something you reached for with both hands, something you took back when you decided you were worth more than the weight someone tried to hang around your neck. In the end, they sat together in the chair by the hearth, their joined hands resting on the worn wooden arm. The fire's glow painted them in a light that was not borrowed from the day or the storm, but their own.